factors will also decrease, which is what we need to consider. And then as well as that, if we talk about the everyday person, it could just be simple tasks in terms of just wasting away muscle. It could be something as simple as, wanting to go for a walk daily, or just trying to go up a steeper hill than usual, or the usual hill that they used to do and they go back and do it and they struggle with it. We're just talking about muscle maintenance, or just having some form of strong muscle mass on us is so important for just doing everyday movements.
And he's here. He is here. Cristiano has entered the building. Welcome, wherever you are, to the Old Trafford Theatre.
Welcome back, guys, to another new episode of the Sculpted podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Rhyse Gonsalves. Rhyse, please introduce yourself to us.
No, thanks for that, Val. I'm Rhyse Gonsalves. I'm a performance nutritionist. So currently working in professional football with West Ham United in their academy setup and with the women's first team. As well as that, I run my own private practice with general public, athletes, various sports, kind of all over, semi-pro, amateur, all the way up to elite, as well as do some stuff with some corporate work, so corporate nutrition, just helping employers to instill and educate their employees on better health and nutrition to kind of help their companies as well. So yeah, a real mix in there from me. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Just quickly, Rhyse, I think that's honestly quite fascinating, and it aligns perfectly with Sculpted and our message in the fact that you're working with corporate people. I think typically when we think of nutrition and things like this, it is typically towards the sports aspect, where I think that in all areas of life, nutrition being very crucial in many areas, but having it in business, it is really a 1% detail where it might be that clarity of thought. It might be that execution and articulation just for that mental rehearsal, things like that, where nutrition really can have that impact. And I just found that really interesting, that even the attention of detail can be translated through all areas of life, which again is perfect to why we have you on today.
Yeah, 100%. That's something that I think is quite big, and it's growing in that sense. You can kind of connect with people on personal level in terms of business, but as soon as you look at these ideas of, okay, do you know what, how do we get them? We think about performance. Is performance, yes, in elite athletes or in sport is one thing, but every day someone has to perform for something. So whether that is their daily job, or just functioning and trying to do the best that they can do for their purpose. So then we think, well, okay, let's translate that into corporate work. It is, okay, so they need to be able to, start the day strong, limit illness, because if their employees are getting sick all the time, then that restricts the business, and that actually limits their potential. So if they can kind of keep everyone well, everyone feeling good, maybe provide the right nutrition and food sources inside of the business as well. Like a lot of companies offering snacks, drinks, etc. So are they probably giving the best stuff to kind of help them, and things that aren't going to make them feel heavy, tired by the time it hits lunchtime, and you get that afternoon lag is kind of what we try and help people to avoid, so they kind of stay productive for the majority of the day.
That's really interesting. I think that the real attention to detail of caring about the retention of even employees, making sure that every single day that they're there, it is very, very related to football in itself, because obviously as a footballer, you don't just ask your coach for a day off. If you do, you might not be able to ever train again. I know I've heard a few stories where players have asked for a day off and they've never been able to train again. So it is really, it transcends into all aspects of life, and I think that only maybe in the top 1% of businesses can they even necessarily afford obsessing over that fine of detail, which is, again, really, really interesting to see how only at the top can people start caring about that if they have the attention and the resources to do so. But I think that when you're at the top, it's much harder to stay there, and that's maybe one reason why when someone is at the top, they might find more of a need to attend to these finer details to make sure that they're going to stay there, which again is perfectly in line with what we are at Sculpted, because we want everyone to be able to give their best version of themselves every single day. So by the end, you're left with this grand sculpture of yourself.
No, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. That's it. It is, I think it's really good. We're seeing a lot more companies, even those that aren't necessarily, the top of their industry sort of thing. They could be almost like startup companies who are, doing well a few years in, but they still take kind of that care and privilege to their employees. They want to look after them. So we are seeing it in these smaller companies, smaller firms as well, where they're like, oh, it is something that they value, which is really great to see. So it's not necessarily just the big ones anymore, where you see, oh, look, they have the resources, they have the time and energy they can put into it, where we are seeing these, I say, employee-focused companies coming through, this newer generation, I suppose, where it's very people first, like the whole work from home, and there's more allowance of things and what they can do to kind of be more flexible. And it really buys into that. So it's actually really great to see this whole landscape of just all these professions buying into it and being like, oh yeah, that's it. This, what, even if it's come to a talk for us just so we can educate on certain topics, or what they might notice there's certain things that maybe is in winter. I notice a lot of people are dropping off sick. Or how can we prevent that? It's just from little things to that to, the bigger stuff of, yeah, can you come and help build out a little bit of a plan for us? But it's great to see that it's kind of covering across the board now in total. So yeah, it's really exciting. Pretty good.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that it's a good leeway into our next topic of discussing protein. And I think that for athletes specifically, it's definitely something that we do really need to care about. Obviously, with Vale and his background in the supplement industry, I think that discussing the importance of protein, not just in football, but even obviously with your background with the corporate side, I think that's an interesting topic to even talk about, because we don't just have footballers on. We have people from any background who are listening to this episode right now and understand the importance of protein. I know Val would say he would have a controversial take to protein and to the importance of that. So if Val or Ash want to have any questions around that and take us into the next kind of topic, that'd be good for me, boys.
First of all, I have one quick thing. Could you maybe give the listeners or us even a bit more specific definition of what the differences are between a normal nutritionist and, you already touched on the base, performance nutritionist? What are the key roles or differences between those things? Because I often think, or many people out there don't even know what the differences are between a performance nutritionist. What are their specific roles? What are they doing?
Yeah, no, definitely. So we normally see nutritionists kind of come through as, if they're just nutritionists, it's more like the health route. So that it'll be human nutrition. It is the basics of, energy, macronutrients still get covered, micronutrients, but then maybe how that plays into adolescence, infancy, elderly, like all these populations that make up everyday life. And it's basically allowing you to be healthy, to function, to look after yourself, but without having to necessarily go into detail or concern yourself with, okay, you're trying to fuel yourself or just live, as well as you're trying to perform at an optimal level in whatever that is. So whether that is sport, whether that's business, whether that's, you name it, there's so many different things. That's the main split. So the main focus is purely on the health of that person, so that we can help you. So if we look at the performance nutritionist, it is very much the same. So we take all of that landscape. That is always our foundation as well. We look at the person first. We look at their health. We look at every lifestyle factor. But then what we want to do is we want to build on that by saying, okay, on top of that, you don't just sit around. You don't just do X, Y, Z. You also train 5 days a week, or you commute plus work plus travel plus fly regularly on a regular basis, and therefore we need to factor all this in. So when it comes to that, we've taken the health into account, but we now need to add on all these additional expenditures of energy, of what we're using our muscles for. Do we need to look into certain strategies or interventions that will help you to then perform at that level? So again, if we talk about football, we talk about sport, it's okay, we know we're controlling your life well in the sense of we're giving you all the foundations of a healthy, balanced diet, making you kind of feel healthy and well. But on top of that, can we get you so you're performing optimally in training every day? You're, I don't know, periodizing your carbs, your meals. You are in the gym and you have enough energy to kind of, you know, maybe push yourself in the gym as well as the protein afterwards to recover. And then maybe any supplements around that or certain ergogenic aids where we're trying to boost performance, you know, those 1% in match, whether that's, you know, like caffeine or creatine, and we can kind of take it on like layer by layer and we kind of take it up. So if you think about I don't know if you've seen like the nutrition pyramid, which is almost like the base is always going to be your basics. It's your human nutrition. That is just get everything right in terms of what you're eating. Don't worry about all the fancy stuff. Get that right. And then we can build up layer by layer to add on now your exercise. Great. Now your supplements, etc. So we kind of get the basics right, build up. And all we're doing is rather than focusing on that bottom layer of the pyramid, we're just kind of taking it up to the top and we're just layering in all this new information as we go with the athletes.
Yeah, so back onto that, you talked briefly about sort of the supplements, protein and creatine, for like two just to name. Obviously you work with all ages, so young kids up to the women's first team. Do you recommend protein supplements and creatine to those players, or is it sort of individualized?
It's when it comes to stuff like that, it's always individualized in the sense of every person's different, everyone's needs is different, so we'll always take that into consideration. But with something like protein, when they start coming full time with us as part of our academy setup, or the women's are first, their first team is full time, they're in every day, then they're of that kind of 16-year-old plus, and the aim is, we know protein targets we're quite happy for them to hit. We encourage, we want them to hit these high targets, so we'll always have protein available to them from basically the age of 16 up. It's something that we will encourage. Just as a source, we're always a food first approach. So we will always, yeah, that's it. Yeah, so we will always try and get everyone to do it through whole foods and through whatever we can give them, or encourage them to have at home and take. But there is always examples and times, especially when we look at, like, let's say 16-year-olds who train of an evening. There's a very busy schedule, and there's a lot of time where you'll find between school, then coming to training, then getting home to have dinner. There is a lot of time where most kids around that age of like 15, 16, they won't eat. And when we think about protein, it's something that we regularly need to keep having throughout the day. So they're going this probably 5-6 hour window with nothing potentially. So let alone fueling up for training some of them. We also are missing these probably 2 feeding windows for protein, which is just eating into their current muscle. So when we think about that, these age groups are massive for growth. This is where we normally see some, peak height, growth, velocity sort of stuff going on. They're kind of maturing, and it's an optimal time to start building on that. So this is something we don't want them doing. So they're going the other way, where they're really not sometimes maybe hitting enough in the day. And we need them kind of going the other side, where they're kind of getting the maximal amount to really make the most of all the adaptations that they can get from training in the gym.
I guess the next question would be, so obviously protein of sort of like a recovery meal, right? Obviously, it kind of rebuilds your muscles, all that sort of gist. I'm not too nutritionalized, I'm not really educated like some of you boys, but I do know the basics. Obviously, after you train, you want to get some protein to kind of, bring back what you lost. But kind of on game days, I'm just curious, after games, do you recommend, like, obviously I know personally me, I fast, well, not fast, but I don't eat usually before a match day. Say I play at 3 o'clock, I wouldn't eat after maybe 10 or 11, just personally my own sort of choice. But like after the match, what are the things you kind of recommend to your players?
So there's a couple of ways there. Like, I know that's what you do. And the first one on that fueling. So what I always say is we aim to do our last kind of meal about 3 hours before kickoff. And it's typically, you will get some boys who are like, or some players in general who just genuinely don't like eating that much close to kickoff. So it's one of those things, especially from a younger age, it's good to work with them to kind of build up that tolerance. Because the big thing is that the gut is like, you got to treat it like a muscle, in the sense of, if you just go, never doing it before and have a large meal, then go play within 3 hours, odds are it's not going to sit too well with you. But if you can take your time with it, slowly build it up over like a good period of time, think of it just like you're doing some sort of training regime there, and you're slowly building it up, but basically the gut tolerance gets stronger and your stomach can basically gets better at absorbing all these nutrients that it's taking in, as well as allowing you to not feel that distress when you come into playing. So ideally, we want to kind of keep the fueling going as close to kickoff as possible, because even when we get to kickoff, with like an hour out, we still encourage, bars as well, bananas, drinks and stuff like that. These things to kind of keep the fuel topping up, so when they go into their game with like 100% fueled up, ready to go. So it's just one thing.
Is that more so like those like fast? Oh, sorry. Is that more like those fast absorbing sugars, like your energy gels and sort of like your carbohydrates, stuff like that?
Yeah. So what we normally do is anything up to around like an hour and a half out. You can have your bars still. You can have we always have like Rice Krispie Squares or Belvita bars and Nutri-Grain bars, etc. But then once we get to that kind of less than an hour to kickoff window, it kind of switches to the fast digesting. Sorry. So that's like your energy gels, Haribo sweets, sports drinks, stuff like that. Anything that we can kind of quickly get into us, which can rapidly get into the bloodstream, because by that point we don't want anything going in through our stomach really to digest. We just want it to be able to easily get in without causing anything in our gut. So yeah, as we kind of have that tapering period where it goes big meal, more complex snacks, but they're still not high fiber, they're still low in fiber, and then we get to that really fast digesting just before kickoff basically. And then
I was just thinking, for some of the listeners who maybe aren't too even familiar with why, I guess we kind of went on to the periodization of timing and things like that just there, but if we talk about the need for protein for just in individuals in general, I think you briefly touched on even the importance of regular amounts of protein. Why do individuals in every aspect of life, whether it's sport, whether it's business, why is protein so important, and why do we actually need it as a main macronutrient?
Yeah, I'll couple that with Ash's last point as well, actually. So when we think about protein, it's purely for our muscles. So we know carbs are for fueling. Protein is predominantly for our muscles and for that repair process. There are amino acids that allow kind of help other things happen in our bodies, but if we think about the main process for it can be for those muscles. So when we look at it throughout the day, our muscles are constantly turning over. So the best way I always describe it to clients and to athletes is, if you imagine you've got a building or a brick wall, and then you've got two sets of workers. One set is building up that wall, so they're there to construct, and the other side are to demolish it and break it down. They're constantly working at the same time. So as soon as one's doing one, the other one's doing the other. The only difference is the only time that they're building up is when we consume protein, because that's providing those workers to do that job. Whereas our body will always naturally keep breaking it down. They're always working 24/7. They'll just keep going. So if we stop consuming any protein, then we're constantly just breaking down muscle. It's just the way our bodies work. It'll keep doing it. It'll keep doing it over and over again. So when we think about protein throughout the day, we need to kind of keep giving it these random hits throughout the day to keep these workers going throughout, and therefore we stay in a net protein balance, which means we finish the day either on zero, which means we've not lost, we've not gained, or we finish it in a positive state, which means we've ended up with a bit more than we did yesterday. Yeah, that's it. So and that's all it is. So that's why we do it. So if we think that on a graph it's constantly doing that in terms of our protein throughout our muscles, throughout the day, then we need to keep giving it these spikes of protein, which means it'll keep doing this on a chart. So we have these regular feeding windows. So we'll try and say every 3 hours or so to get a good hit of protein, a good hit of good quality protein. So, 20 to 30 grams plus every 3 hours or so. and that way you're giving your body all these hits to keep that maintenance, because our body doesn't store protein. So it's not like carbs where we can fuel up and be like, okay, cool, I've eaten so much and this can just sit and be saturated by my muscles and be ready to use. When we have protein, it's actually, right, take it in, down to amino acids, I'll absorb as much as I can at this moment in time, but that's it. Once that window's passed, it's gone. So that we don't have anything left in that tank sort of thing to keep replenishing the muscle. So we need to wait for that next feeding opportunity to then get back into that positive. So that's roughly every 3 to 4 hours, which is why we say every 3 to 4 hours, good quality protein hit, 20 to 30 grams. And then that will keep your muscles like topped up throughout the day without going into that negative balance.
That's brilliant. I think that like visual cue and like perspective it makes a lot of sense for anyone listening right now. And I think, Val, if you want to quickly go into what your thoughts about that are, because Val has a very similar belief in that, and I think that with his knowledge, you'll definitely want to tap into that. So Val, if you want to go on that one.
First of all, I really liked your analogy that you used with the workers. I always simplify it for myself in terms of I say protein is like the glue for our muscles, which keeps it together. After we have intense exercise, we all know we always get micro tears whatsoever, because it's just normal. We have an intense session or intense workout in the gym, and our muscle fibers get small little tears. So I always say the protein is like the glue in order to keep it all together and make it stronger. What I wanted to touch base on is all the things you already mentioned in terms of youth athletes. They have bigger periods of times where they may not consume anything, not even a snack, no carbs, no protein in general. I love that point because I have a similar perspective. I believe that if you have a intense training session, for example, or you have a busy day, first of all, school, then some time off, and then maybe training in the afternoon. Most people maybe skip something or tend to go for an unhealthy choice or immediate craving they have. So they could have a negative impact for their long-term performance.
I think you liked it.
I would also, I would recommend, from my personal perspective, that you have always, like being prepared is key. Always having a snack available. Probably most efficiently a protein snack, because you already said it, we try to top off the protein. I personally believe that we need to switch from prioritizing carbs more. Of course, athlete needs carbs in order to fuel, to perform, to gain energy from, but we need to take a more specific focus on getting those proteins in. But on that contrary, here comes my controversial perspective. I believe we consume too much protein per serving. For example, I will explain. Let's say you already said we should try and split out over the entire day. I have the same perspective, but I believe at the moment, speaking from experience and from different examples, for example, my brother, he sometimes skips breakfast or has a quick muesli or some quick carbs whatsoever. So you've already lost the chance to consume some kind of protein in the morning. Second of all, if you have a big plate, you eat 2 or 3 meals a day, and you consume all your protein in those one sittings, and you have 50 plus grams of protein per servings, you often get these digestive issues. Many people are maybe sensitive because the overload of protein is too much. Maybe the body can handle it, but the digestive system and the metabolism need to try to tolerate. What I want to say is, what is your perspective on it? Do you also believe that most people, or even younger athletes, don't have the education? They don't even know when should I consume protein, how much protein, or is it okay if I consume more protein than I actually need?
Yeah, so I'll try and work through that there. So to start with, I think the protein intake in general throughout most people, including adolescents, young athletes, is pretty good. They do hit the targets. I personally, I do set protein targets relatively high. It's always around 2 grams per kilo is why I aim for, and that's why I propose to most, only because that will cover maintenance as well as recovery on top of that, not including injury. If we go into like injury states, then we're looking at probably 2.5 times per kilo just to try and maintain muscle mass whilst in that injured state. But I agree on the breakfast front. I think that's a youth athlete as well as adult athletes do that too, where it's always harder to, I think, find high protein options at breakfast, and therefore I feel like it's something that's easily skipped over, and therefore, yeah, they'll often find this window not being fulfilled first thing in the morning, and it won't be until, you know, that next feeding, maybe around lunchtime after training, that they actually get that first proper hit of protein, which I think is something that is improving, and it's something that I push on a lot, in terms of with the players I work with and the athletes I work with, that morning feed needs to be good enough. It's a great place to kind of get that intake. In terms of how it works, and I think in the gut, I think that one of the reasons we do it is not just, obviously, there's muscle maintenance and muscle recovery are all big factors, but we also look at satiety, so how full it makes us. So protein, it takes a while for us to break down and metabolize. So because of that, it leaves us feeling really full for quite a long time. So it's actually a really good source for that. So it stops people from, maybe you've got some people who are a bit more prone to, snacking and maybe not the greatest self-control sometimes, and they need something to kind of help them. Whereas high protein diets are incredible for that. And they'll just leave you so full that you're not going to want to eat anymore. And it's a good upside to it. Again, it's like most things. If you overconsume, again, to overconsume a protein, lots of studies are showing, is incredibly hard. And even then, the worst case is it leads to gut issues, like GI distress. So I think it's one of those where building it up to that point of, I'd say, 2 grams per kilo. So if you weigh 70 kilos, then we're looking at around 140 grams of protein in a day. And the key to it being, split it up across all those hours of the day. So if we've got 140 grams there, we can easily split it up over 5-6 different feedings across the day. And I think that's really important as well, as we often see like skewed distribution throughout the day with most people, where it'll be the least at breakfast and then the most at dinner. And that dinner serving could be, for some people, 60 grams plus of protein. And I know we normally say, 20-30 grams plus, because that's optimal, but that's more so because we know that's where we get the spike, we get the response that we want at around that point. So that's great, aim for that. But some people will be able to absorb probably majority of the 60 grams. That's because how their body works, they'll be able to do it. Others won't. But again, with this skewed distribution, if we find that in the mornings we're not really having much and we're having loads of it in the evening and it's only getting bigger and bigger each meal, then yeah, we might get some bit more discomfort in the evening if we're ramping it all the way up and getting loads in that last kind of 6 hours of the day. So yeah, I think that's really important, is to really spread it out and make sure we're not consuming, massive amounts, either all together with really minimal time between, or just making sure that we kind of are allowing that space between them, as well as not going, maybe too high with it, too close together. I think would be my key points with that.
Following up a question, I think the biggest takeaway from here is splitting up your protein intake throughout the day. Let's take, for example, a person or an athlete or a normal person who's fasting. I think a good example is Nick at the moment. He's trying himself out with fasting and different fasting windows. What would you recommend for such a person who's fasting in order to cover their protein amounts? As we just discussed, we're trying to break the protein intakes apart into different servings. But for example, if they only have small windows, what would your take be on that?
Yeah, so I think it comes down to, I guess, one is how long are the fasts for you?
So for me, it depends. There's a bit of background on why I fast. It's because I'm trying to get my body fat percent down, and I have a history of eating disorders. So this is like the first ever strategy where I'm actually seeing progress. So for me, my windows vary, but I typically stick to a 18-6, so 6 hour window. But on rest days, I try and do a 1 hour window, but that's just because I really like to challenge myself. But typically a 6 hour window for most days.
Wow. Yeah. So that's the thing is, I'm all for I'm all for intermittent fasting. Like at times I will do it myself. I think on a much, again, everyone's different. Everyone will have different kind of responses and things that they find is like works well as their new norm and how they can cope. I regularly would say like a smaller window is preferred. I think only up until like if you say night before is your last meal, great, and then you're sleeping through and maybe you go till I don't know late morning, midday, maybe that kind of 12, 1 o'clock is probably fine as you're still kind of utilizing it. You've managed to kind of cut out at least one feeding opportunity, which is enough to probably cut down, I don't know, 500-600 calories. That's quite a good meal when we think about a good purpose for intermittent fasting. The only concern there, I guess, with a large 18 hour plus a 6 hour window or even like a 1 hour window is if we're getting below like our BMR rate, which is like our basal metabolic rate, then that's just kind of like the base minimum that we kind of need just for our bodily functions, let alone everything else. Then even if that was at the point of, I don't know, 50, 1600, getting 1600 calories of, good quality sources as well, and all the nutrients you need in that very small window will be particularly difficult, as well as, and again, like kind of stressing on that point of the nutrient side, are we getting all the nutrients we need in all these foods as well? Enough, again, as we just touched on, we're talking about protein. If I said, cool, in that 6 hours, you need to get 150 grams of protein in a 6 hour window, odds are you're not going to be doing it. That's it. That's especially in the 1 hour window, that's 1 meal. So we've gone from maybe like 2 meals to 1. And then even again, that's very extreme. So I'd say that's my main concern as to why I wouldn't recommend or push that. But that's my front. And again, I'm not saying anyone's wrong with that, but that's just from my point of view. That's my point and my push. But I'd say if you are going to do any sort of fasting, then let's say the night before is my big thing that I push to everyone, including myself, is a pre-bed snack. And that, I think, is so undervalued and underrated by many athletes and many people, where I think that if we can get a pre-bed snack in, so something hopefully that's dairy-based, ideally, as basically dairy is, most of it is casein protein rather than whey. So casein is slow digesting. So we get that kind of hit, and it comes up on our, as I was talking to you earlier about that protein turnover, is that protein synthesis where we're building that muscle. So rather than coming up and going down like a normal complete protein would or a whey protein would, it takes us up and then it just stays for quite a long time. So that's normally, if we have it before bed, in this state of, our body is going to do the most recovery whilst we're sleeping, but also we're not doing anything. We're just laying down. So really our body should go down and to start breaking down our muscles. But if we have this, it will just sustain us throughout the night until we get to that next feeding. So I would definitely recommend before any kind of period of fasting, whether that's just overnight up until midday sort of thing, I recommend a really good quality dose of, hit of casein proteins, like a dairy. So whether that's milk, whether that's Greek yogurt, anything like that, to kind of give you a really good casein protein ingestion, and then that'll really kind of set you up well going into a long period of not having any protein.
I think that's a very interesting point for 2 reasons. I think, first of all, for me, obviously with my fasting, it's a new strategy, but as I mentioned, it's the only way that I've actually seen progress in the past 4 years of myself. So I'm a little bit messed up. So I think unfortunately it's a strategy that's working for me. But something that the boys know about, and I was even speaking to a friend just before about this, is my black and whiteness in an aspect when it comes to nutrition. I'm very black and white, and for me, typically, the more complex I make it, the more off track I go, if that makes sense. So, for instance, at the moment, I'm pretty much only sticking, and I know how ridiculous this is, but for me, it's working. So, I'm pretty much only eating lentils and carrots, which is ridiculous. I know it's ridiculous, but throughout the whole day, I've found that to get a reasonable amount of protein. Actually, I'm also having protein powder from Vale, which is his company, Sint. So I also am getting my 2 servings of protein before and after training, which is good. Because that's also in my fasting window. I try and have from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. So before training and after training, I'm able to get my protein there. But then my lentils, I think that I get a reasonable amount of protein from my lentils, and then I get a decent amount of carbs as well. It's a very, very boring meal. Like, I'm literally having plain lentils. I know it's ridiculous, but for me, that's what's working at the moment. And then I have some carrots for my vegetables. But as I said, I know it's ridiculous, and I know it's not a sustainable way of doing it. But for me, this is actually what's working. And as I mentioned, I've gone through so many different strategies working with numerous nutritionists. I also am lactose intolerant, which means that whenever I try and have, previously when I wasn't using Sint, which is Vale's company, I would have digestion issues going into training with having protein powders. Now with Vale, his protein powder, I don't have this issue because his protein powder, I don't react from his whey isolate, which is amazing for me because going into training, because I would typically be having, the dairy products, I would always be very bloated during training. But now this is an issue for me, and I feel like it's kind of allowed me to have a more bland diet that's worked for me. But that's, again, a very personal kind of strategy of mine. We recently were speaking with the Brentford nutritionist, Ted, and he was also speaking about how a misconception that I actually had was even how much protein we can consume in one serving. And we talked about how I actually thought that it was just a well-known fact that it's 30 grams of protein that you can observe per serving. And then even you mentioned then it is individual again, but people can consume 60 grams per serving. It's the amounts of protein. And as Val said, a good anecdote for consuming a lot of protein at once is myself, because when I'm only eating 1 or 2 meals a day and then I've got the protein supplements in between, I am really just trying to force as much protein down as possible, which again, it's probably not the best strategy. But I think when you were talking about the snack before bed, I also found that really interesting because Val, Ash, and we all use Whoop. I saw you've got your Apple Watch on, but I'm not too sure if you're familiar with Whoop. But basically, we're able to track patterns and things like this that benefit our recovery. And for me, intermittent fasting, I recently found out on my monthly review that intermittent fasting has actually improved my recovery by 15%, which is like actually crazy. So I've never even heard of something improving recovery that much, but I think that it's due to my window of when I eat food, because obviously the closer you eat to bed, the more disturbed your sleep will be in terms of digestion and things like that. I also wanted to know what, maybe Ash even wants to discuss this, because I know that he has his own, not theory or opinion, but he has a question where he wants to talk about the dairy and the aspect of dairy and the digestion of it, because Val and we're both lactose intolerant. I think maybe I have a bit of a worse lactose intolerance because I have to have like low FODMAP and all that stuff. But Ash, if you want to go into the area of dairy and things like that, I know Ash has a few questions about that.
You talked about the dairy before bed. Now, these two, Nick and Val, obviously lactose intolerant. What would you recommend before bed for those guys? And the second thing was, I guess, I saw this, I don't know if it's real or not, so you could probably help me out finding some truth in this, but I read this thing saying that like the ability to actually tolerate lactose is sort of a genetic mutation, because we're not supposed to consume dairy or lactose. But I'd love to get a nutritionist sort of advice or, I guess, say on this issue.
Just quickly on that, Ash. Just to go into a bit of deeper context on that. So what I believe that theory is, it's that humans were evolved to tolerate dairy products if you think, I've heard some theories of people saying that dairy is maybe for our ancestors, it was like a poison. And over time, we started to all adapt to a higher dose of dairy intake. And I think today, I think that everyone, I'm not too sure about this. Again, this is only from research that I've done myself, but I think everyone to a degree is lactose intolerant, which may lead into this theory of people being not completely lactose intolerant today, but our ancestors maybe had lactose. It was almost as a poison, and over time we've adapted to tolerating lactose at a higher level. Is that, as Ash said, is this true? Is it not? And maybe what's another way that people like Val and myself could actually utilize the protein before bed?
Yeah, so I'll do my best with this one. But the first one on alternatives for both Val and Nick, both yourselves. When someone can't have dairy, then the next best option that we'll go to is soya as a milk replacement. So I don't know if you've ever tried soya milk, but when we look at the components of soya, it's basically the best plant-based version that is the closest to real dairy, like the closest to milk, in how it's made up. It's not, obviously not all the way there as a complete protein, but it is the closest match, and it's still significant. You can get a significant amount out of it. So when you look at the amount of protein in, let's say 300 ml of each, milk will have more, but the soy milk will always actually have the highest of the plant-based, and it's actually not that bad. Like potentially can get up to like 7 grams or so in a glass of milk. So it's great in that sense, and it will be the next best choice for doing that. So you might not get as long as a promotion in the muscle protein synthesis as you would with a casein source, but it's better than nothing, and it's only going to be positive for you, and it takes away all that lactose element completely. So that would be my best shout for you. And then on that second point, won't go into too much detail stuff that I'm not 100% on, but in terms of actual lactose, so the way we break down lactose is through enzymes that we all have, and so everybody has different levels of enzymes and how responsive and how active they are, and that kind of develops up to some people's levels of sensitivity. So if some people don't have as many, and they're not as they're not as good, or they're not as efficient, I guess the word, at breaking down this protein. So once this comes into it, then we need these enzymes to break down. So we've got lactase is the enzyme which will basically break down the lactose, and that will leave us with being able to absorb, process it. Great. The less of that we have, and the less efficient they are, then the more sensitive we're going to be to it, because as it's going through our system, it's not getting broken down, which means it's kind of just being able to just pass through, and that's where we'll get GI distress, we'll get stomach cramps, bloating, and then potentially other than the worst side, like where you feel ill, you feel like potential diarrhea, stuff like that. That always is like the latest effects of it. So in terms of that, it's more so a tolerance, as you say, like people are lactose intolerant, but it typically comes down to, like most things, see, we have this, do we have the other thing that needs to control it? And that's pretty much what we talk about with lactose, is that do people have the enough of the enzymes required to break it down? If not, they're more along that either lactose intolerant, because maybe they're not breaking it down at all, or they're not very good at breaking it down, which allows a lot of it to pass through without being properly digested and broken. Whereas if we're pretty good at it, and those people who don't really get too much reaction, it's because their enzymes they've got quite a lot, and they're working pretty well and doing a good job of breaking it down before it hits the gut, which means we're not going to get any of those, or very limited on getting those GI distresses. If that helps.
Yeah, that definitely does. So obviously, like, you got oat milk, right? So we know oats are a very good source for breakfast in the morning. How would that compare with soy milk? So if I was to choose oat or soy purely based on taste, like that doesn't matter. The taste is irrelevant. Based on like nutritional benefits, is that still the better choice, soy milk?
I'd say I think it comes down to what your aim is, and two, preference. I think it does. Because we know there's soya, oat, pea, coconut. You name it. There's so many. I think it does come down to that personal preference of taste, 100%. But all of them will provide different levels of different nutrients, or I suppose like macronutrients. So when we look at, as I say, if we're focused purely on protein and getting the best source of protein without consuming milk, or maybe we have vegetarian or vegan athletes, then the next best thing to whey, or that complete protein, is the highest level of protein in a plant-based source is soya. So that's why we look at, okay, so that would be the go-to if that's our aim. We were looking at getting a high protein intake, maybe we just want to maintain or build muscle, recovery, you name it. But then we've got the ones like coconut milk, almond milk, which are very low in a lot of things. They're not very nutrient dense, and they're not calorie dense either. They're very light, and they're a bit more on the water side, I guess you say. They're a bit like more of a liquid. They're not thick and creamy. They're just there basically. They do that part, which is great. As a taste, that's it. If people like almond or coconut and they want that just to taste nice, then amazing, cool, that's great, go for it. There's not much protein in it or anything like that, not much carbs, not much fat. You're not going to get too much out of it in that sense. And then you look at the oats, which will have not a bad protein, but not a high. It would just kind of be, it's all right. It has higher carbs than the others, because we look at where the source of what oats are. Oats are a good carbohydrate source. And therefore that plays into that role. But then that's quite a thick and creamy alternative for people that kind of want the next best thing to texture. So it does kind of come down to what's your goal, what texture do you like, what taste do you like. So I would honestly say with that sort of stuff, you can kind of go with what you prefer and what you like, because there's definitely other ways, I guess, in your diet of getting the sources for what you need, if that makes sense.
Yeah. 100%. Nick, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, with I believe that. So I know quite a bit about like soy and soya chunks. Even I know that that's quite a good source of protein. I believe it's quite a cheap source of protein. Again, with me and the lentils, the reason why I chose lentils is because the protein isn't too bad, and then also it's quite cheap. So living in a college apartment and not actually being on a professional contract, but not living a luxurious life, cheaper alternatives. I believe that soya chunks are even quite cheap in themselves, for just thinking about for ways that people can access protein, because I know typically people associate the need of protein with being an expensive thing. Sometimes it's not necessarily either. But I believe that with soy, there may be some problems in when you take it in abundance. Obviously, at the lower levels, you don't have many problems, but I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the estrogen levels of soy products can have some negative effects for younger males or even all males. I'm not too sure, but if you want to clarify any difficulties or problems that may arise from an overconsumption of soy products, is that true?
That's correct. So if we go through to like over consuming and too much of anything, we'll have its negatives or its downsides. But yeah, with soy, it is higher levels of estrogen. So if we over consume it to that point, then we may see it having that negative impact on our health performance through that gateway. And that's just basically just one of those things we try and be a bit more wary of. When we talk about really over consuming in terms of we're having it like most meals and in very high dosage. But if we have it typically in a version of milk or once a day, or we're having soybeans with certain meals and stuff like that, it's relatively fine. It's harmless. It's not gonna negatively affect you too much. It's more when we talk about these extreme amounts, so we're kind of getting into quite high intakes, that it becomes a bit more of an issue.
Just to go on to the last kind of topic of the side effects of not reaching our protein targets, and what we see in footballers today, I think that when we look at players like Riyad Mahrez, who are extremely, well, obviously lean, but obviously also lack the muscles that other footballers have. So if we look at Ronaldo, even maybe critiquing him and saying maybe he is too muscular. I have a friend who is a professional footballer who I would say is one of the most muscular players that I've ever seen in my life, or almost comparable to a much leaner version of Akinfenwa. And I think that negatively, I'd say that actually negatively affects him. And he's a goalkeeper, so for him having too much muscle, the contraction of a full extension of an arm can be limited because of too much muscle. And I think that it's almost he's done too good of a job with his nutrition and physical adaptation to where maybe it's a hindrance. So if we want to talk about the negative side effects of not hitting your protein intakes, where maybe you are, I wouldn't say necessarily underfueling, because you could be fueled quite well in terms of carbohydrate aspect, but the people who I think as footballers, as you were saying, it is very important for footballers to rebuild that wall, because we are constantly breaking that wall down. And for those people, maybe like Riyad Mahrez, maybe he was just constantly knocking that wall down and he didn't give his muscles and his body the time to repair with protein or adequate rest. But the negative side effects of not hitting the protein intake, is that something that as humans, I guess, not just even footballers, is that something that we really do need to take into more consideration?
I think so. I think that it's something that everyone should be just aware of, in that how important protein is, and the distribution of protein throughout the day, and the amounts that we can actually withstand and take, and how people should be encouraged to have that across the day. But yeah, I think that if we aren't hitting it on a regular basis, and we're just allowing this constant protein breakdown to occur, then yeah, we're going to see a drop in, muscle size. Obviously is the obvious one that everyone thinks of. We're not going to have as much muscle mass, but I think it's also important to remember that along with everything that comes along with that, so with that muscle wastage, you're then losing strength, which is a key factor, which then will knock on, if we talk about a performance issue here, it's speed, it's power, it's everything to do with jumping, etc. All these factors will also decrease, which is what we need to consider. And then as well as that, if we talk about the everyday person, it could just be simple tasks in terms of just wasting away muscle. It could be something as simple as, wanting to go for a walk daily, or just trying to go up a steeper hill than usual, or the usual hill that they used to do and they go back and do it and they struggle with it. We're just talking about muscle maintenance, or just having some form of strong muscle mass on us is so important for just doing everyday movements. And I think that this often gets forgot about, especially as people get older and go more towards the elderly, where they could actually benefit from probably greater intakes of protein, because their rate of breakdown is higher. They don't move as much. There's a lot more wastage going on. They probably eat less in total, in terms of total energy. So when we think about all these factors, there's different populations I think that definitely need more, and that includes the elderly, sporting populations, etc., as well as adolescents growing. But I think just for that, we're coming back to that performance perspective. It's really important that we hit these targets, and we kind of have this daily net positive net balance of muscle maintenance, of muscle synthesis happening, because we don't want to see people getting weaker, reducing power, reducing explosiveness, sprint speed dropping, acceleration, because these are going to end up on the pitch. They're going to become evident, and they're going to obviously be detrimental to performance. I do think it's worth saying as well, it's not always the most comparable. I think you look at some people who maybe don't have the largest of muscles, but they could still be strong, because I think that it's often people mistake it as, the larger the muscle, the stronger the person, when yes, in theory, most of the time that will be the case. That will be that person's strength will correlate with their muscle size, but not everyone, because if someone's sole gain, if we look at you see a lot of bodybuilders, stuff like that, where yes, physique wise they might be very large, they might be very high levels of lean muscle mass, but they might not have the strength of your everyday person who goes to the gym every day to train specifically for strength, but not size. So when they go for size, yes, we get increase in muscle fibers, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase the number of muscle fibers. We will get some strength gains from that, but it doesn't mean we're not targeting strength. So we're not solely trying to improve our strength. So we'll get some, but we're not getting the max that we could be getting out of that. Whereas if we get someone who, sorry, go on. That's right. No, yeah. So, and then with that, if we have someone who is pushing on strength and solely focused on strength, that they might have less muscle mass, so they have less fibers. But at the same time, in terms of strength, it's just how many fibers can you recruit for the job you're trying to do, and that's where strength comes in. So if they can maximize, nearly all of their fibers, they're going to be stronger than someone with more fibers but can't activate half of them. Except as a rough example there. And then we look at power, and we look at, okay, that is how quickly can you recruit as many fibers as possible, and that gives you your explosiveness, your speed, your jumping, everything that needs to be very, very quick and active. And then that comes down to completely different. So if you're training specifically for power, then you're training for that purpose. So I think whilst body types are definitely a factor, you'll definitely see a lot that they're kind of, these norms are there for a reason. There's always going to be outliers, and where some people may look on a pitch, let's say, as, oh, do you know what, they're really lean, not much to them, but in terms of holding their own and physically, they're probably very good. And we look at, say, example like Mahrez, his speed is great. He's got lots of speed. He's clearly a very explosive player, and we know that, which means that he's clearly got a good level of muscle mass for him that is also very good at recruiting his fibers. So I think it's also important to remember like context in it as well, in terms of position and how that person wants to play and feel, because that will always just like kind of dictate the makeup and how the training and nutrition should then impact them going forward. What do they need to tweak? What do they need to change? Or are they happy with where they are?
Oh, just a little thing about the you said the bodybuilder and the sort of power. So I go to a local gym here near where I live. It's a powerlifting gym, and we've got like everyone. We've got like bodybuilders, U11 athletes as well, powerlifters. I've noticed like huge difference. There's a lot of bodybuilders, and the bodybuilders are actually quite weak for how they look. Like they might be like 80, 90 kilos. They'll look great, but I know someone that'll be like around the same body weight and will just be absolutely like killing them in everything. And that's just from a power perspective. You said like they may look good, but they might not be strong. So that was just the only thing I could kind of say about tying it back there.
I also, just to add on that, I've heard of even Chris Bumstead, who is very famous for being, Mr. Olympia. I've heard that even his big lifts, obviously being with the physique that he's got, it's crazy. But even just not day-to-day gym goers, but people who are, dedicated to the gym enough, just standard bodybuilders who maybe don't compete, I've heard that even they are quite outlift him quite heavily. And I think that's even surprising. So just to your point before with, it is kind of relative to each person, and different people train for different reasons, and it doesn't necessarily relate physically to what we see, but it is very personal and respective to also an individual's goal. So for this example, for the footballers, I think that we do want strength, we do want explosiveness, we do want power, but you might not look at a footballer and think that, they have the physique of a bodybuilder, but they might be lifting the same, and they probably shouldn't have the physique of a bodybuilder, because if you look at a bodybuilder trying to run, their range of motion is completely different to a footballer, and a footballer needs to be quite mobile and agile, and these things don't correlate too well. Well, I think that's a little bit off topic from the main focus, but I think, Vale, if you have any more questions before we start to wrap it up, I think that'll be good just to touch on.
One small question I have, because we've touched base on dairy and lactose intolerance, on a personal perspective or question, do you face or work with a lot of athletes in the women's team or the younger ages where people have lactose intolerances, which, yeah, that's my question.
Do you know what, in terms of that, it's more so, yeah, we'll have some, I guess, who, in terms of my own practice as well, and people I work with, it's more people who will report, sensitivities, and it's more of an understanding of they know certain foods that maybe react worse than others. Some things they're quite happy to take, and they're like, oh, I get no reaction. Some things, and that's dairy, and then the other dairy products they'll take where it might not agree with them, and it doesn't leave them feeling too well. So it's more about, again, you spoke about the FODMAP earlier and stuff like that. So if it's one of those where if people growing up habitually having certain foods and they know some things sit with them, even though it's dairy, but they think that, oh, certain dairies set them off, then it's also being like, oh, that's fine. I know that these always sit well with me. They never upset me. Therefore, I'm not going to exclude them from my diet just because they're dairy. And it's kind of keeping them in. But anything that you kind of have isolated as a potential problem or something that's potentially causing you distress, then by all means, like, if it's not kind of helping you and it's only giving you a negative effect, then we'll kind of try and take that out of the equation. Let's find an alternative of something that you might like that can try and give you a similar benefit. That'll always be the front on that. I think another good point around intolerances, sensitivities, or even dietary requirements is probably like vegetarian and vegan athletes and people in general. Especially talking about protein, as I feel like a lot of people in general have this misconception that if you're vegan or vegetarian, you can't hit protein intakes because it has to be done through meat or dairy, as we've been talking about, or fish. And therefore, sometimes they feel quite excluded from it, or they feel like, oh, there's no point because I can't do it anyway. Whereas I think that there's a really key bit of education there to kind of help people, is that you can do it. There's, as you say, you've chosen lentils. They're a very good source of protein, as well as we talk about soya beans, again, another good source of protein. Like there's although it's a lot lower than, let's say, a chicken breast, which we can talk 20, 30 grams plus in that one solid portion. But if we start spreading it across all different vegetables and all different things, then we're going to accumulate that protein across a meal. So the biggest thing when I work with, vegetarian and vegan athletes, it is yes, it's going to be a bit harder for you, but it's definitely not impossible. So we look at including as many different vegetables on a plate or in a meal as possible. However we do that, like that could be simple as, smoothies, which include different vegetables, fruits, nuts, stuff like that. We can kind of really get it through if they want something like that, or if they do want a proper meal, then it is just kind of include as many different ones as you can. As we say, like if we have 5, 6 different types of vegetables, but each portion of those vegetables is ranging from 3 to 6 grams of protein across the board, then yes, it's not much for that one item, but when we add all 5 or 6 up, then we're pushing up to 20 grams, maybe more. So it just means we've just got to make the most of each meal and have it really diverse, really varied, and really colourful, and just try and get it through all these other sources. But it also means that these meals are also very nutrient dense as well. So we know that through that they're getting a lot of the nutrients they need, and we're ensuring there's no any nutrient deficiencies occurring, as well as being able to also hit calorie goals for our energy intake. So yeah, it's one of those things I think that's definitely important to press on, that protein targets can definitely be hit even if you have certain dietary requirements.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a common misconception for a lot of people, I believe, would be that you do have to be eating all of your meats and whatnot to hit your protein targets. But I know from a personal experience myself, I mean, not that I track calories anymore because that was a bit problematic for me, but just doing a few estimates in my head, I know that I'm not completely under the need of my protein, maybe hitting it every day, but I'm definitely not far off because I'm able to, have my syn protein powder before and after training, which helps me. And then with my lentils as well, I'm able to get a fair amount through that. But with that kind of leading towards the last question for you on the Sculpted podcast, we just want to ask you, what are 3 ways that you sculpt yourself on a daily basis of 3 practices or principles that you try and ingrain into your athletes or people who you help on a daily basis to sculpt themselves to become the best version of themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. But personally, I think it's quite on topic. I think that again, everyone's different. But it's also, I think it's finding routine in what you're doing always helps. It helps your body find a routine. So for me, like nutritionally as well, I think it helps the people I work with as well as myself. Again, that's tying in everything. That's just tying from how I start the day to how I finish the day. Like I said, like pre-bed snack, great. I've set myself up well for the night, as well as, you know, protein hits throughout the day. I always try and get it every 3 to 4 hours, and try and be quite strict on that to make sure, especially knowing I'm very active. I think tying in another way I sculpt myself would probably be with what I like to do and how I like to keep active. So I run a lot each week. It's probably one of my happiest times of the week is when I get to go out. I get to put the headphones in and just go run for. I try and plan it a little bit, but it's kind of just what I feel like on that day. But yeah, again, if I'm running, 4 to 6 times a week, then that's great. But I also take that into account into, right, how's my days looking around that in terms of my nutrition, am I fueling right, am I recovering right? So I think that's really important. Doing something that's kind of that stress reliever, as well as gets you physically moving and makes you feel, gets your heart rate up and feeling good. And then on that final note, I'd say adherence, but I'd say the way to achieve adherence is through what I basically always try and preach, which is it has to be enjoyable for someone to want to adhere to it and keep doing it. So it's all well and good me just saying facts or figures to someone, but if I don't tie that into how it benefits them as them individually as a person, how does it suit their lifestyle, their life, their goal? Does it fit their motivation, which is going to drive them to want to do it themselves? Then, because if it doesn't tick those boxes, then it's absolutely pointless, because I can tell them it, get them to do it whilst I'm there for one day, but they're never going to carry it on themselves. I think that's really important. Is lots of people will jump on fad diets and stuff like that, which is, it's never sustainable. It's never going to really support you, rather than making healthy daily habits and building a routine up of this. So I think that finding that adherence and keeping it enjoyable. So if you don't like the gym, then why are you going to the gym, sort of thing like that? Like, that's not going to be the thing that helps you. But if you know you really like a sport or something like that, and you're like, oh, but I'll do that because it doesn't feel like I'm exercising, I'm enjoying it. There you go. That's your key. That's your goal to get moving more. So I think it's definitely that third one is just keep it enjoyable. Make sure you're doing everything that you want to be doing, because the moment that it feels like a chore, or you feel like you don't want to be doing it, then you're not going to be sticking to it, and you're not going to be motivated enough to keep going with it.
Yeah, I think touching on that last point, something that we talk about quite a bit is the flywheel effect, and what I refer to as momentum, but we're going to do an episode about the flywheel effect and having that momentum through tough times where, as you mentioned, if you're not doing something that you love, for football, for an example, I mean, I don't love training. That's an unfortunate fact for me, for at least. I never really had even a love for football. Again, I'm a little bit crazy up here sometimes, but I still do it, but I do it more than anyone else. And I think that that comes through a love of being in that momentum and being in that flywheel. And I think that trying to find that peak level of arousal where you can continue doing something, that actually, like for me, for example, the one reason why I think that I've been able to stick to my intermittent fasting is because I love suffering for some reason. Like I love sticking to the very boring lentil diet, because previously I've always been doing too much. I've been trying to get my protein in throughout the day so many times, and I've been obsessing over that too much. But I've found success through suffering on this very, very boring diet, and that's actually, weirdly enough, again, something up here, something's all right, I think, but it was actually helped me keep going. And it's, as we've said this whole time, it is completely individual to who you are and what works. But I think that's a perfect way to kind of wrap it up, and finding out the importance of protein. And I guess reiterating the importance of individualization, because I think that it does vary from person to person, even talking about different strategies of for Val and myself, looking at different alternatives to going having that snack before bed. It is always very individual, and trying to find that right strategy for yourself. I think that there's power in that, because the people who are listening right now, we haven't given them necessarily an action sheet to follow through, because that won't work for everyone. And that's the reality of nutrition. That's the reality of individuals and how we are programmed to work. So it is what we're trying to do is provide you guys listening with as much information as possible, so that you can take away the best bits that work for you and what don't work for you. And the only way you can find out what works for you and what doesn't is by failing, which is actually what our last episode was about. So I encourage everyone who's listening now to take action and take notes from this episode and what Rhyse has talked about, because there's a lot of knowledge in here. Obviously, Rhyse he's been working at the top level, and we all can learn from everyone's situation, everyone's anecdotes. And Rhyse, we really appreciate your time today joining the Sculpted podcast. It was an absolute honor for us, and we really enjoyed your wisdom and your time today to help all of our listeners, and obviously help ourselves as well, because the three co-hosts here, we live by Sculpted. We always want to sculpt ourselves every single day, and even just the hour 15 that we've had together today, it's really been brilliant for all of us to even just make ourselves 1% better today. So again, we really appreciate your time, and yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks a lot for having me on, guys. It's been great.